so far, what we did yesterday, with perhaps a new angle, and then we have a break. Okay. So we were saying that, I was talking about the cyclicality of economics. I don't think we showed this one yesterday, did we? No. The idea that economic theory is cyclical, Kene and physiocracy, the rule of nature. And the rule of nature was the market. And Mr. Kene was the physician of the French king, and he represented the farmers. And the farmers wanted free trade in grain, but the problem was that these farmers actually made money by withholding grain from the market, and that created a shortage of bread in Paris and the French Revolution. Right? So this is what we would call speculation. And you can read the newspapers at the time saying, well, there's a free market, it's impossible that there can be a shortage. And there was a shortage because of speculation. And this is, again, similar to what we have now. And if you really go back in history, you find that in Florence, which was an island of a civilized state in the middle of feudal states, if you go back to the year 1200, they had laws prohibiting taking food out of the city. Strange law, but the law was obvious because when we see what happened there, it was to prevent speculation. If you saw that prices were going up and you managed to move food out of the city, prices would explode and you could make a lot of money. So these speculation, and that's what we get here after the break, and the financial sector. Classical economics, Ricardo, 1817, is free trade. Is the theory of free trade and comparative advantage, peaks in the 1840s, repeat of the Corn Laws in 1846. Then you have a bad, first of all, you have a very bad financial crisis in England in 1847, and then you have a bad year in harvest from Finland down to Spain in 1848. And that is what creates the 1848 revolutions, right? So this is why I call it in the 1848 moment what we have now. I don't want a revolution, but just that people change their mind. And then you have new classical economics, new classical synthesis, Paul Samuelson, 1848, peaks in the 1990s, and it dies now. So I think this is the big picture. And the fact that Sanders and Trump are essentially saying the same things about free trade, I think is very, very important. The model doesn't work even at the core. And this, I think, is a very important argument. If it doesn't work in the United States, how could it work here? So, the 1848 moment, when the old order collapses, because it's attacked from the political right and the political left at the same time. Unusual, but this is the Trump-Sanders. The overly abstract theories collapsed, and the old elites are under attack from all sides. There was an English lawyer writing in his memoir saying that if he went to sleep in 1846 and woke up in 1848, you woke up in a completely different world. Right? And this is I think we're seeing now. And this quote from John Stuart Mill: "It often happens that universal beliefs of one age of mankind, a belief from no one was, nor without an extraordinary effort of genius and courage, could at the time be free, becomes to subsequent age so palpable an absurdity that the only difficulty then is to imagine how such a thing can never ever be credible. It looks like one with crude fancies of childhood, instantly corrected by a word from any grown person." If we get free trade between Silicon Valley and the tribes in the Amazon, do we think that they will get equally rich? I mean, this is absurd, right? Therefore, I think it is, in a way, important to point at the absurdity of the thing. And when I try to explain comparative advantage to people, I say, well, imagine there's a village on each side of a river, near, or one river. And then they're both in the Stone Age. Right? And then the people on the left bank see that the people on the right bank have new tools. They're into the Bronze Age. Right? They have tools made from bronze and no longer from stone. So then you have a choice as a tribal council on the West Bank. Do you try to emulate, do you try to copy the tools of the Bronze Age, or do you say, no, my comparative advantage is in the Stone Age? Okay, you say your comparative advantage is in the Stone Age. And then the Bronze Age, they go into the Iron Age, and they go into the Industrial Age, and whatnot. But you still have a comparative advantage in the Stone Age. Right? And economic theory tells you to stay in the Stone Age. This is the absurdity of Ricardian theory. If you think about it, it's an insult to common sense. But the problem is that we have two generations of economists now who grew up with this. They for the first 3 or 4 or 5 years, this is what you hear. And then in the 5th year, when you were completely brainwashed, or you're allowed to use different assumptions, right? But then you have been brainwashed into this irrelevant theory. So, and I'm enthusiastic because I think this 1848 moment is coming. And some of you saw this, Marx and Engels, 1848, 3 books, Marx and Engels, Communist Manifesto. Marx was asked about free trade once, and he said, I am very much in favor of free trade, because if you have free trade in the wrong situation, it will produce a revolution. So Marx was in favor of free trade because it will bring poverty and revolution. He fled to England, Hildebrand, another German economist who was so conservative he had to flee to Switzerland in 1851, and then you had John Stuart Mill. You've seen this before. And what I think you should dig out of this is John Stuart Mill's idea of infant industry protection. That a businessman knows that a company cannot, in the first 4 years of a production company, companies don't make any money. So, and it's just like that with the whole industrial sector. It doesn't make any money, so you have to protect it until it can stand on its own feet. So, it's always I found it very useful to use people's heroes against them. Right? So with English liberalists, you use their own theorist, John Stuart Mill, against them. We saw this, remember, this productivity explosion, and this is what I talked to you about, but I don't think I showed you the effect of diminishing returns. Ecuador, can we get this sharper? Is it this one? Well, yes. Reasonably sharp. Diminishing returns in bananas. 1960s, very good. There was a disease of the bananas in Central America. So, production collapsed. So, this was a chance for Ecuador to increase the share of the world market in bananas. So you see, they cultivated more and more land, went up from 90,000 to about 180,000. They doubled the area under bananas. But look at productivity. The yield per hectare is a mirror image of the area cultivated. This is not surprising to agricultural economists. But the point is that there's only one province in Ecuador, Provincia del Oro, which is really suited for bananas. And if you go outside that, it's not so suited anymore. So this is what's happening if you produce wheat, you're going to run into diminishing returns. This was the argument for industrialization in Australia, that we should only produce wool, but if we produce wool, we will go into areas of diminishing returns, where it's not so efficient, and then our wages will fall. So the only way to stop wages from falling, said the Australians, is to have an industrial sector. Because the industrial sector would set a minimum wage for the whole country, so that people would not move with the diminishing returns into poverty. This is very important. And the English 19th century economists, they understood diminishing returns very well. They didn't understand increasing returns. But this is very important. And you see here, when they're back to the same area, you see this production is a bit higher. It's a bit higher here than there. And that's technological change, or improvement of crop. But that's completely dwarfed by the diminishing returns, right? So yes, you have improvements, but the improvements are completely dwarfed by the diminishing returns. And this is an important drawing. This is the productivity explosion from a different angle. Learning curves. And the learning curve plots the number of labor hours you need to produce a product. There's something called experience curve, and the experience curve, you plot the total costs. So here in 1850, in the United States, it took 15.5 hours to produce a pair of shoes. In 1900, 1.7, 1923, 1.1, and then 1936. You see how it flattens out, right? So this is like the productivity explosion. And rich countries produce where the learning curve is steep, and they import, they export where the learning curve is steep, and they import where the learning curve is flat. And this is automatic in a sense, because when the learning curve is steep, wages is not very important, and skills are important, so you can pay high wages. Here, technology is well known, and the wage level becomes a crucial variable. When there's no technological change, you compete on lowering wages. Here you compete on new technology, right? So, United States exported shoes here and started importing shoes there, right? And this is the curse of the poor countries. This is Mexico. Mexico has an interesting trade statistic, wage statistics, because they have a wage statistics for normal industry, and then especially after NAFTA, in North American Free Trade Association in 1994, they had the so-called maquilas. And a maquila is superficial industrial production which is found on the border, the northern border of Mexico to the United States. And there, the Americans export everything. Well, they send the things that become wage sensitive, where there's no more learning. When there's no more learning, they send these goods to produce in Mexico because it's sensitive to wages, right? And Mexicans have cheaper labor. So the maquilas in northern Mexico have much lower wages than traditional industrial sector in Mexico. But the traditional industrial sector in Mexico is dying out, right? And they get more and more specialized in this area. So Trump complains about how bad deal Mexico is, or NAFTA was for the United States. I would say it was even worse for Mexico, right? Because even in agriculture, wheat production, which is mechanizable, moved from Mexico to the United States. Tomato production and strawberry production, which is very manual, moved from the United States to Mexico. So the Mexicans specialized in being poor and in doing unmechanizable things. This is very crucial, right? Wheat is mechanizable, strawberries are not. Right? So even inside agriculture, these activities are very different. So this is you produce wheat, but it's a commodity, but at least it's not. You don't handpick it, right? With tomatoes. So here is an important part of my theory, which is that economic activities are qualitatively different, and I've produced this quality index of economic activities more than 20 years ago, and I'm saying that there is black and between black and white, there are many shades of gray, obviously. And economic theory, standard economic theory, assumes perfect competition. It assumes that the barriers to entry into business is zero. Right? So the strange thing is that economic theory assumes a world where nobody is making much money, or any money at all. So in a sense, economic theory is made for wheat. It's not made for Bill Gates, because Bill Gates is up here with dynamic imperfect competition. So the high quality activities have new knowledge with high market value, steep learning curves, high growth in output, rapid technological progress, high R&D content, learning by doing, imperfect information. Investments come in large chunks. That's very important. Remember we talked about the house painter. You know, the house painter has a very low quality activity. But if you wanted to make a new drug, medicine, you know, that's a big project which makes it imperfect, very imperfect competition. And it's also patented, right? High industry concentration, high wage level, barriers to entry, branded products, produces linkages, produces innovation, and the standard neoclassical assumptions are irrelevant. So you know, the shoes used to be up here, now they're down there. And if you look at baseballs for the American sport, baseballs are still hand-sewn. And they used to be made in Haiti, now they're made in Costa Rica and Nicaragua. And they paid $1 an hour at best. Both balls are fairly high-tech. So what you pay for the wages is not important, and you need engineers. So the most important, the most efficient golf ball producers in the world are in the United States, New Bedford, Massachusetts, last time I looked at it. And they make $18 an hour. And these people who are the most efficient producers of baseballs make $1 an hour, right? So this has been the theory of economic development all the time. This was development economics in the 1970s. The stuff I was trying to teach in Latin America in the 1970s, that you have to move up to these high quality activities, right? And house paint is something that it's very easy to do. You know, there are hundreds of companies only in Southern California. Automotive paint, you know, paint for cars is much more complicated. There are thousands of colors. The quality is important. You have metallic colors, which are very difficult. So there are only a handful of producers in the world who do full range of automotive paint. So the problem with this is that you have to go into, you cannot say this sector is so and so. You know, the paint sector is very different inside it, and the balls for American games is also very different. So it's complicated, right? But if you go back to Belarus, I think what happened in Belarus was that, you know, they stayed up here, but in very inefficient versions, right? They produce these high-tech things, but in a very inefficient way. But the important thing here is that it makes them, what do you say, twice the GDP?
Twice GDP,
yeah.
In real terms.
Twice the GDP in real to stay up here being an inefficient producer of industrial goods, right? And of course, you know, probably if you got a little more technology, you could improve it in Belarus. But I think this idea is, I think, coming to maturity. But it's going to kill Ricardian trade theory as it was killed after 1848. And by the year 1900, Ricardo was completely dead. He was out of the textbooks. But now it's back again, right? So it's this abstract series coming up and down. And unfortunately, there was a question yesterday about German economics. Unfortunately, many of these economists that were kind of demolished Ricardo, they were Germans. And unfortunately, they disappeared after World War II, and that's a problem. So I was thinking, if we stop here and have a break, and then we'll let first questions to this, and then if you have any questions, and then we look at the financial sector in the end, which I